My parents let my brother move into my apartment while I was abroad. Now they're mad I want him out, and I've been abroad for almost a year, traveling for work and a bit of adventure. I'd sublet my apartment to a friend while I was away, and I had the perfect plan to come back, settle in, and enjoy the peace of my own space again. After spending hours on a plane, all I wanted was to drop my bags, collapse on the couch, and maybe order some takeout. Instead, I walked into the twilight zone. The first sign something was off was the sneakers in the hallway. I don't own sneakers that big or that beat up. Then I saw the living room. My bookshelves were cluttered with stuff I didn't recognize. A gaming console I definitely didn't own was hooked up to my TV, and the coffee table was covered in half-empty soda cans and a plate of what I assume were nachos before they fossilized. "Yo, you're back." Mason's voice boomed from the kitchen, and my little brother came strolling out like he owned the place. "What's up? What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my cool. I was too jet-lagged to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Oh, yeah. Mom and Dad didn't tell you? I'm staying here for a bit. Just temporary, you know." "Temporary? No one told me this." I dropped my bags and glared at him. "You're joking, right? This is my apartment." Mason shrugged, as if it were no big deal. "Yeah, but you were gone for, like, ever. Mom and Dad said it'd be fine. I didn't think you'd care." My blood pressure skyrocketed. "You didn't think I'd care that you moved into my apartment without asking? How long is temporary?" He avoided my gaze, scratching the back of his neck. Not sure yet. I got laid off a while back, so, just till I figure things out." That's when the anger really hit me. Not only had he invaded my space, but apparently my parents had signed off on it like my opinion didn't matter. I pulled out my phone and called my mom. She picked up after a couple of rings. "Ryan, welcome home. Honey, how was the flight?" "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "did you know Mason's living in my apartment?" She hesitated. "Well, yes. We thought it would be fine. You were gone, and he needed somewhere to stay. It's just temporary." "No one asked me." I snapped. "Honey, don't be so dramatic. He's your brother. Families help each other." "Families help each other? When did that mean steamrolling boundaries?" I hung up before I said something I'd regret and turned back to Mason. "You need to leave. Today." He looked genuinely offended. "Dude, where am I supposed to go?" Not my problem. But Mason wasn't budging. Instead, he made himself a sandwich and plopped down on the couch like he owned the place. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't just drag him out, but I wasn't about to let this slide either. That night, as I lay in the bed I hadn't slept in for a year, I could hear Mason's video games blaring in the living room. It was surreal, and not in the welcome home way I'd envisioned. I couldn't believe my parents thought this was okay. Mason had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I'd spent most of my life cleaning up his messes, but this was a whole new level. The next morning, I confronted him again, hoping a night to think about it would make him see reason. "Seriously, Mason, when are you leaving?" He didn't even pause his game. "I don't know, man. Mom and Dad said you'd be cool with it." "I'm not." "Well, it's not like you need the space. You're barely ever here anyway," he shot back. The sheer audacity made my jaw drop. I spent the rest of the day alternating between calling my parents, trying to get Mason to listen, and venting to Ella, my girlfriend. She was sympathetic, but also practical. "Maybe he really doesn't have anywhere else to go," she said over the phone. "You should talk to your parents again and figure out a timeline." "A timeline?" I muttered. "He shouldn't be here at all." "Well, you can't just kick him out onto the street," she reasoned. I hated that she was right. As much as I wanted to throw his stuff out the window, I knew I couldn't. But every hour that passed made it clearer that Mason wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. By the end of the day, my frustration was boiling over. I called my dad, hoping he'd be more reasonable than my mom. "Ryan," he said in his usual no-nonsense tone, "he's your brother. He needs help, and I need my space. This is my apartment. Why didn't anyone ask me?" "Because you would have said no," he replied bluntly. I was speechless. They knew I'd say no, so they just did it anyway? I ended the call and paced the apartment, fuming. Mason had trashed my place, hijacked my life, and apparently my own parents didn't think I had a right to be angry about it. But the real kicker was that this wasn't just a mess I could clean up in a day. Mason wasn't going anywhere, and my family was siding with him. It was only the beginning, but I already knew this wasn't going to end well. The next few days were a whirlwind of tension, arguments, and passive-aggressive standoffs. Mason stayed glued to my couch like he'd been fused to it. My apartment, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a prison I shared with a disrespectful, freeloading cellmate. Every attempt I made to reason with him was met with indifference or some half-baked excuse. "I'm looking for jobs," he'd say, scrolling on his phone. Or, "I don't have anywhere else to go," as he sprawled across the couch, crumbs collecting in the cushions. I called Ella almost every night to vent. "This is insane. He's not even pretending to look for another place." She sighed. "I know it's frustrating, Ryan, but have you actually talked to your parents face to face? Maybe you need to make them understand how much this is affecting you. They don't care. They've always babied him," I snapped, pacing the small kitchen. "Then show them you're serious. Get everyone in the same room and lay down some boundaries." She had a point. Phone calls weren't cutting it, and if I didn't take a stronger stand, this temporary arrangement could turn into something permanent. So, I bit the bullet and called my mom, asking for a family meeting. She sounded hesitant but agreed. We met at my parents' house a few nights later. The air was thick with tension as I walked in, greeted by my mom's nervous smile and my dad's stern, expectant expression. Mason, of course, was already there, slouching in a chair and scrolling on his phone like he had better things to do. "Ryan," my mom said, ushering me in, "why don't you sit down?" I made coffee. I didn't want coffee. I wanted answers. "We need to talk about Mason staying in my apartment." My dad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What's there to talk about? He's family. You're supposed to help each other out." I bristled at the word supposed. Help? He's taken over my space without asking, and he's not even trying to find another place. This isn't helping. It's enabling. Mason snorted. "Calm down, dude. It's not like I'm trashing the place." "Really? Have you seen the living room? You've turned it into a landfill." I shot back. "Ryan, that's enough." My mom interjected, her tone soothing but firm. "Mason's going through a tough time right now. He lost his job, and rent's expensive. We thought you'd understand." I might have understood if someone had bothered to ask me. I snapped. "Instead, you just decided it was fine for him to move in. Like my opinion doesn't matter." There was a long pause. My mom looked at my dad, who cleared his throat. "Ryan, you weren't even here. What were we supposed to do? Let him be homeless? He could have stayed here with you." I gestured around their perfectly spacious house. "Why didn't he move back home?" Mason finally put down his phone and spoke up. "Because I need to be in the city to find work." "Genius." I glared at him. "Do you even have a plan? A timeline? Or are you just planning to squat in my apartment forever?" "I'm figuring it out," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. "That's not good enough," I said, turning back to my parents. "If this is temporary, then I want a deadline. 2 weeks. That's more than enough time to find another arrangement." My mom looked stricken. "Ryan, be reasonable." "No, Mom. I've been reasonable my whole life. This is my apartment, and I'm done being walked over." She opened her mouth to respond, but my dad held up a hand. "Fine. 2 weeks," he said gruffly, surprising everyone in the room. Mason's head shot up. "What?" "You heard him," my dad said. "You've got 2 weeks to figure it out." I almost couldn't believe it. For once, my dad was on my side. Mason, however, looked like he'd been betrayed. "Unbelievable," he muttered, grabbing his phone and stomping out of the room. My mom sighed, rubbing her temples. "Ryan, was this really necessary?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm not the bad guy for wanting my space back." She didn't respond, and the silence was deafening. Part of me felt guilty. She clearly wanted to help Mason, but another part of me was relieved. For the first time in days, it felt like I had some control over the situation. The next morning, I got a text from Mason. "You didn't have to ambush me like that. Thanks for making me feel like crap, ***. I didn't reply. I wasn't interested in coddling him or getting into another argument. But later that day, something strange happened. Ella called me, her voice hesitant. Hey, I just got a weird DM from Mason. What? Why is he messaging you? He said he feels like he's being unfairly targeted and wanted me to talk to you. He said you're blowing things out of proportion. I groaned. Seriously? He's trying to turn you against me now? Well, I'm not siding with him, if that's what you're worried about, she said quickly. But maybe you should keep an eye on him. He seems off. Off how? I don't know. Just desperate. Be careful, okay? It wasn't like Ella to sound so uneasy, and it left me feeling on edge. Something about Mason's behavior wasn't adding up. He'd always been impulsive and immature, but this felt different. There was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite put my finger on, something darker. Later that evening, I ran into Grace, my neighbor, while taking out the trash. Grace was friendly enough, though a little nosy, and she seemed eager to chat. So, your brother's been staying with you, huh? She said casually. Yeah, I muttered, not really in the mood to explain. She tilted her head, her expression curious. He's been pretty busy. Lots of people coming and going. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Oh, just, he's had a few friends over. Late nights, loud music, that kind of thing. My stomach sank. When? A few times in the last couple of weeks. I figured you knew. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my cool. Not only had Mason taken over my apartment, but now he was treating it like a party pad while I was gone, and I had no idea who these friends were or what they were doing there. Thanks for letting me know, I said tightly before heading back upstairs. As soon as I walked through the door, I confronted Mason. What's this about you having people over? He blinked, feigning innocence. What are you talking about? Grace told me. Late nights, loud music. My neighbors shouldn't know more about what's happening in my apartment than I do. He scowled. So she's spying on me now? Great. Mason, I'm serious. What's going on? Nothing, he snapped. I had a couple of friends over. Big deal. It is a big deal. This is my home, not your hangout spot. If you pull this again, you're out before your 2 weeks are up. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off to the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, seething. I'd hoped the family meeting would be the turning point, but it was clear Mason wasn't taking anything seriously. The clock was ticking on his 2 weeks, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to end smoothly. The days dragged on, each one more frustrating than the last. Mason had retreated into full-on sulking mode, barely speaking to me unless it was to complain about something. His 2-week deadline was looming, but there was no sign he was making any effort to leave. Every time I brought it up, he'd roll his eyes or say, I'm working on it. If working on it involved sitting on my couch and leveling up in some RPG, he was a star employee. But the real tipping point came when Grace knocked on my door one evening, her expression a mix of concern and hesitation. Ryan, I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but, she trailed off, glancing over her shoulder. I saw your brother meeting up with some people in the parking lot. It looked sketchy. Sketchy how? I asked, my stomach tightening. She hesitated, then leaned in closer. I don't want to assume anything, but it looked like they were exchanging something. Money, maybe. I didn't get a good look, but it made me uneasy. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Grace wasn't one to stir up drama without cause, and the way she spoke left little doubt that she was genuinely worried. My gut told me this wasn't just another one of Mason's immature antics. Something more serious was going on. Thanks for letting me know, I said, my mind already racing. That night, I decided to do a little digging. After Mason went to bed, I quietly checked the spare room where he dumped his stuff. Most of it was just clothes and random junk, but buried under a pile of hoodies, I found a locked metal box. It was small but heavy, and the fact that it was locked only made me more suspicious. I stared at it, torn. Part of me felt like opening it would be crossing a line, but another part of me, the part that was sick of Mason's lies, knew I had to find out what he was hiding. After some quick Googling, I managed to jimmy the lock open with a paperclip. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The box was filled with cash, stacks of it, rolled up and bound with rubber bands. There must have been thousands of dollars in there. Beneath the cash was a small plastic baggie containing what looked like pills. My hands shook as I stared at the contents, trying to make sense of it. Was Mason dealing drugs? Is that what he'd been doing while I was gone? I quickly put everything back, locked the box, and shoved it back where I'd found it. My mind was spinning. This wasn't just about him freeloading anymore. If Mason was involved in something illegal, it could blow back on me, especially since he was using my apartment as his base of operations. The next morning, I confronted him. "We need to talk," I said, cornering him in the kitchen. He glanced up from his cereal, clearly uninterested. "About what?" "About the box in your room." His spoon froze midair. "What box?" "You know what box. The one with the cash and pills." His face went pale, and for a moment, he looked genuinely panicked. But then he scowled, his usual bravado kicking in. "You went through my stuff? That's messed up, man." "What's messed up is you bringing drugs into my apartment." I snapped. "Do you have any idea how much trouble I could get in if someone found that here?" "It's not what you think," he said quickly, but his tone lacked conviction. "Then explain it," I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're dealing." "I'm not dealing," he said, his voice rising. "I'm just holding on to it for a friend." I let out a bitter laugh. "Do you even hear how stupid that sounds? Who's the friend? And why would they trust you with thousands of dollars in drugs?" He didn't answer, just stared at the floor like a guilty kid caught stealing from the cookie jar. "That's what I thought," I said, my voice cold. "You have until the end of the week to get out, Mason. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here another minute. Ryan, come on." "No, we're done." I called Ella that night and told her everything. She was horrified but not entirely surprised. "Mason's always been reckless," she said. "But this is next level." "What am I supposed to do?" I asked, pacing the living room. "If he's mixed up in something illegal, it could drag me down too. Maybe you need to talk to someone. Like the police," she said hesitantly. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "I can't. He's still my brother. As much as I want him out of my life, I don't want to ruin it." "Then you need to set boundaries and stick to them," she said. "No more second chances." She was right, of course. Mason had crossed too many lines, and I couldn't keep enabling him. But part of me still felt torn. He was family, and as much as I hated what he'd done, I didn't want to give up on him completely. A few days later, things took another unexpected turn. I was sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Harper, Mason's ex-girlfriend, standing there with an expression that could only be described as equal parts angry and desperate. "We need to talk," she said, brushing past me into the apartment. I blinked, stunned. "Harper, what are you doing here?" "I've been trying to get a hold of Mason, but he's been ignoring me," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you know what he's gotten himself into?" "Why don't you tell me?" I said, crossing my arms. She hesitated, then sighed. "He owes a lot of money to some very bad people. That's probably why he's been acting so shady. If he doesn't pay them back soon, they're going to come after him, and anyone close to him." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean, anyone close to him?" She gave me a pointed look. "I mean you. They know he's staying here, Ryan. If they can't get to him, they'll come after you instead." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about Mason's irresponsibility anymore. This was dangerous. And suddenly, I realized just how much was at stake. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice tight. "Because despite everything, I don't want to see anyone get hurt," she said. "Mason may be a screw-up, but he's not a bad person. He's just in over his head." "Yeah, well, he's dragging me under with him," I muttered. "Then you need to do something about it," she said, her tone serious. "Because if you don't, this isn't going to end well, for either of you." As she left, her words echoed in my mind. I knew she was right. Something had to change. But how far was I willing to go to protect myself and my brother? The hours after Harper's visit were a blur of panic and anger. I'd thought things with Mason were bad before, but now it felt like I was living in the middle of a ticking time bomb. If what Harper said was true, and I had no reason to doubt her, I was in danger just by having Mason under my roof. My frustration at his freeloading paled in comparison to the fear gnawing at my gut. When Mason came back that evening, I didn't waste any time. As soon as he stepped through the door, I cornered him. "We need to talk. Now." He froze, his eyes darting to my face. "What's your problem this time?" "My problem? My problem is that your ex just showed up at my door to warn me that you've pissed off some very dangerous people." His expression darkened, and for a second, I thought he might deny it. But instead, he sighed and dropped his bag onto the floor. "Harper shouldn't have gotten involved. She shouldn't have had to." I snapped. "What the hell are you doing, Mason? Do you even realize the position you've put me in?" "It's not as bad as she's making it sound," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. "Not as bad," I repeated, incredulous. "She said they'll come after me if you don't pay them back. What part of that isn't bad?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "I'm handling it, okay? I just need more time." "You don't have time," I said, my voice rising. "You're out of here by the end of the week, and that's final. If you're not gone, I'll call the police." His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You'd really call the cops on your own brother?" "If it means protecting myself, yes," I said without hesitation. "You've crossed every line, Mason. I'm done cleaning up your messes." For a moment, he just stared at me, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. Then he grabbed his bag and stormed into the spare room, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, shaking, unsure if I'd made things better or worse. The next day, I called Ella to update her. "He's still not taking this seriously," I said, pacing the living room. "I gave him until the end of the week, but I don't know if he'll actually leave." "You've done the right thing," she said firmly. "You can't let him drag you into his problems. If he won't leave, you'll have to follow through." "I know," I muttered. "I just didn't think it would come to this." There was a pause before she spoke again. "Ryan, there's something else you should know. I heard from Noah last night. He ran into Mason downtown and saw him talking to some sketchy-looking guys." My stomach sank. "What do you mean, sketchy?" "Like the kind of people you don't want to owe money to," she said. "Noah said it looked tense, like they were arguing." I groaned, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Great. Just what I needed to hear." "Be careful, okay?" she said. "If these guys know where you live, you need to protect yourself." "I will," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure how. That evening, I decided to confront Mason one last time. If he wasn't gone by the end of the week, I'd have no choice but to involve the authorities. I knocked on his door and waited, but there was no answer. "Mason," I called. "Open up." Still nothing. Frowning, I pushed the door open and found the room empty. His bag was gone, and so were most of his clothes. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd finally come to his senses and left on his own. But then I noticed the small pile of envelopes on the desk, each one addressed to him. One of them had been opened, the contents spread out in plain view. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer to look. What I saw made my heart sink. The envelope contained a handwritten note, short and to the point. "Your time's up. Pay what you owe, or we'll make you pay another way, ****. Beneath it was a photo of my apartment building. My knees went weak as the full weight of the situation hit me. They weren't just coming after Mason. They were coming here. My hands shook as I put the note back and backed out of the room. I needed a plan, and fast. I called Ella again, my voice trembling. "They know where I live." I found a photo of my building and Mason's stuff. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Ryan, you need to get out of there." "I can't just leave," I said. "This is my home." "But it's not safe. What if they show up?" Her fear was contagious, and I found myself pacing again, my mind racing. Maybe I should call the police. "Do it," she said immediately. "This isn't just about Mason anymore. This is about your safety." I hesitated, torn. Calling the police felt like a nuclear option, but what choice did I have? If these people came looking for Mason, they wouldn't care that I had nothing to do with his mess. Before I could decide, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, staring at the door like it might explode. "Ryan," Ella said, her voice faint over the phone. "What's happening?" "There's someone at the door," I whispered, moving slowly toward it. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize standing on the other side. He looked rough, shaved head, tattoos, and a scowl that could curdle milk. I backed away, my pulse hammering. I think it's one of them. Don't open it. Ella hissed. Call the police. But before I could grab my phone, the man knocked again, harder this time. Hey, Mason, he barked. I know you're in there. Open up. I held my breath, hoping he'd go away, but instead, he tried the doorknob. When it didn't budge, he cursed under his breath and started pounding on the door. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands shaking. He thinks Mason's here. I whispered into the phone. Ryan, you need to call the cops. Now, Ella said. But just as I reached for my phone, the pounding stopped. I listened, my heart racing, as the man muttered something to himself and walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before finally exhaling. That was too close, Ella said, her voice shaking. Promise me you'll call the police. I will, I said, though the thought of doing so still felt like admitting defeat. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. Mason was nowhere to be found, and I had no way of knowing if he'd even come back. Part of me hoped he wouldn't. At least then, I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But as I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone like a lifeline, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Mason had dragged me into his mess, and now I had to find a way out before it was too late. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly. Still groggy from a night of tossing and turning, I grabbed it and saw a string of texts from Mason. Mason, we need to talk. Mason, I messed up. Mason, please don't call the cops. I'll explain everything. Mason, meet me at Dad's house. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. After everything he'd put me through, now he wanted to talk? Part of me wanted to ignore him completely, but another part, the part that couldn't stand unfinished business, felt like I needed answers. When I arrived at my parents' house, Mason was already there, pacing the living room like a caged animal. My mom sat on the couch, wringing her hands, while my dad stood off to the side, arms crossed and a stern expression on his face. The tension in the room was palpable. What's this about? I asked, my voice cold as I stepped inside. Mason looked up, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, he seemed genuinely rattled. I need your help, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I laughed bitterly. Help? After everything you've done, you've got the nerve to ask me for help. Ryan, please, my mom said, her tone pleading. He's scared. Good, I snapped. He should be. Ryan, that's enough, my dad barked, his voice firm. Let him talk. I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall, glaring at Mason. Fine. Talk. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. I owe these guys money. More money than I thought I'd ever have to pay back. It started small, you know? A few bets here and there. But then I kept losing, and I started borrowing to cover it. Before I knew it, I was in over my head. How much do you owe? I asked, my voice flat. 20 grand, he said, his voice barely audible. The room went silent. My mom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. My dad's face darkened, and I could practically feel the rage rolling off him. 20 grand, I repeated, shaking my head. And you thought the best way to deal with it was to hide out in my apartment and drag me into your mess? I didn't mean for it to go this far, Mason said, his voice cracking. I thought I could figure it out before it got bad, but now they're threatening me. They said if I don't pay up, they'll come after me, and anyone close to me. You mean me, I said bitterly. They already showed up at my apartment, Mason. Do you have any idea what that was like? I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted you to get involved. Then why didn't you leave when I told you to? I snapped. You've had weeks to figure this out, and instead, you've been sitting on my couch playing video games like none of this matters, because I didn't know what else to do, he shouted, his voice desperate. I'm scared, Ryan. I don't know how to fix this. You don't fix this by dragging your family down with you, my dad said, his voice sharp. You fix it by owning up to your mistakes and facing the consequences. Mason looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. Dad, they're not the kind of people you just face. They'll kill me. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. As much as I hated what Mason had done, the thought of him being in real danger made my stomach churn. But I wasn't about to let him keep putting me, and my life, at risk. Then you need to leave, I said firmly. Get out of the city. Go somewhere they can't find you. I can't just run, he said. They'll track me down. Then what do you want from me, Mason? I demanded. You're the one who got yourself into this. I'm not risking my safety to bail you out. He opened his mouth to respond, but my dad cut him off. Ryan's right. You need to figure this out on your own. We've done enough to help you, Mason, and all you've done is make things worse. Mason's shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the floor, defeated. For the first time, he seemed to realize just how badly he'd screwed up. That night, I returned to my apartment, my nerves still on edge. Mason had promised to pack his things and leave by the end of the week, but I wasn't holding my breath. Every time he said he'd do something, he found a way to weasel out of it. Still, the thought of finally having my space back gave me a sliver of hope. But that hope was short-lived. Around midnight, I was woken up by a loud crash outside my door. My heart racing, I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, peering through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. Two men stood outside, one of them pounding on the door while the other held a baseball bat. Mason, the first one shouted. We know you're in there. Open up, or we're coming in. I backed away, my hands shaking. Mason wasn't even here, but they didn't know that. And if they broke in, I'd be the one they'd take their anger out on. I quickly dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity as the men outside continued to yell and bang on the door. Come on, Mason, one of them shouted. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The men must have heard it too because they cursed under their breath and bolted. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher until the police arrived, my hands still shaking as I let them in. After explaining everything to the officers, they assured me they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for the men. But even after they left, I couldn't shake the fear that they'd come back. The next morning, I called my landlord and explained the situation. To my surprise, he was understanding and agreed to let me break my lease early. I spent the rest of the day packing up my things, determined to leave the apartment and all the chaos Mason had brought with him behind. Ella came over to help, her presence a comforting reminder that not everyone in my life was a source of stress. You're doing the right thing, she said as we loaded boxes into my car. You deserve to feel safe. I just wish it didn't have to end like this, I said, glancing back at the building that had once felt like home. It's not your fault, she said firmly. Mason made his choices, and now he has to deal with the consequences. As I drove away, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, sadness, and anger all rolled into one. I didn't know what the future held for Mason, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done letting him dictate my life. It was time to move forward and reclaim my space, both literally and figuratively. My parents only cared about my stepmother's kids, so I cut them off. Now they're threatening to sue for family, Tim, and then I'm Alex, 24 years old, and I've finally decided to share the mess that is my family life. To say I've been through the ringer would be an understatement. I've spent most of my life trying to figure out why my parents treated me like an afterthought. Now, I think I finally understand, and honestly, it's both freeing and devastating. Let's go back a bit. My mom, Emily, passed away when I was 8. She was my best friend, kind, patient, and always made me feel like I was the center of her world. Losing her was like losing a part of myself, but I still had my dad, Jack, and I clung to him for support. For about 2 years, it was just the two of us. I thought we were healing together, but then Marissa came into the picture. At first, I was happy for my dad. He deserved to find love again, right? But when Marissa moved in with her 2 kids, Noah, who's 2 years older than me, and Chloe, 5 years younger, everything changed. I became the extra kid in my own house. The first sign things weren't going to be normal was my 9th birthday. I had been excited for weeks, dropping hints about the new bike I'd been dreaming of. On the day, I woke up early, imagining a big surprise waiting downstairs. Instead, the dining room was covered in pink balloons, and Chloe was sitting in front of a massive cake that read, "Happy 4th birthday, princess." Apparently, my birthday conflicted with Chloe's, so Marissa decided to combine them into one party. The bike I'd hoped for? It never came. Instead, I got a box of secondhand books because Chloe really wanted a unicorn-themed celebration, and those things aren't cheap. That was just the beginning. As Noah and Chloe grew up, my dad and Marissa poured everything into them. Noah got new football gear every season, personal trainers, and a car for his 16th birthday. Chloe had ballet lessons, gymnastics, and private tutors. Me? I was lucky if I got lunch money. Once, I asked my dad why they didn't seem to care about me the same way, and he said, "You're older and more independent. They need more support." That logic might have made sense if I hadn't been 12 at the time. By high school, I gave up trying to compete. My grades were solid, I stayed out of trouble, and I worked part-time to save for my own college fund. When I graduated, my dad and Marissa didn't even show up. They were at Chloe's regional gymnastics competition. I moved out as soon as I could, scraping together every penny I had to get a tiny apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Harper, my girlfriend of 3 years, has been my rock through all of this. She's the one who encouraged me to start therapy, and let me tell you, unpacking 2 decades of family neglect has been a trip. For a while, I tried to maintain some kind of relationship with my dad. I'd call every couple of weeks or stop by the house for holidays. But every visit was the same. Marissa would barely acknowledge me. Noah would make snide comments about my job. I manage a coffee shop, nothing flashy, but I'm proud of it. And Chloe acted like I was some annoying neighbor kid who overstayed his welcome. The final straw came last Thanksgiving. Harper had encouraged me to give my family one more chance. I hadn't been home in over a year, and she thought maybe things had changed. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. The dinner started off tense. Marissa was busy setting the table, chatting nonstop about Chloe's upcoming recital. Noah arrived late, and everyone acted like he'd just returned from a tour in the Peace Corps. My dad asked me if I was still working at that little coffee shop. For the record, I manage the place now. But what really got me was Chloe. As we sat down to eat, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Why do you even bother coming? You're not really part of this family." The room went silent. My dad didn't scold her. Marissa didn't tell her to apologize. My dad just muttered, "Chloe, that's not nice," in the most half-hearted way imaginable, and moved on like nothing had happened. I left before dessert. Harper and I talked about it for days. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd never be more than an afterthought to them. I realized I'd spent my entire life trying to earn love and attention from people who didn't seem to care whether I was around or not. I was done. So, I cut them off. No calls, no texts, no visits. At first, it felt like ripping off a Band-Aid. But then, something strange happened. They didn't try to reach out. Weeks turned into months, and it was radio silence. I thought, well, that's that. Then, out of nowhere, my dad showed up at my apartment. Harper was there, thankfully, because I think I might have lost it otherwise. He acted like everything was normal, like we just had a minor disagreement. He said they missed me and wanted me to come to Chloe's birthday party the next weekend. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my cool, "I don't think you understand. I'm not part of that family anymore." His expression hardened. "You can't just walk away from your family, Alex." I laughed, actually laughed. "That's rich, coming from you." Harper stepped in, calmly explaining that I needed time and space. My dad didn't take it well. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, then stormed out. I thought that was the end of it, but boy, was I wrong. After my dad's surprise visit, I felt a mix of emotions, mostly anger, but also a little guilt. Harper kept reminding me that I wasn't wrong to set boundaries. She's amazing like that. Still, part of me wondered if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have been more patient, more understanding. Maybe I could have handled the whole situation differently. But then I'd think back to all those years of neglect, the countless times I was ignored or pushed aside, and the guilt would fade. Cutting them off was the only way I could protect myself. A week after my dad's visit, I got my first text from Marissa in years. I was so shocked to see her name on my phone that I almost dropped it. The message said, "Hi Alex. Your father told me about the little falling out you two had. We're family, and family needs to stick together. Chloe would love to see you this weekend for her birthday. Let me know what time you'll be here." I didn't respond. I didn't even know what to say. The audacity of her acting like everything was fine, like she hadn't spent the last decade pretending I didn't exist, left me speechless. Harper saw the text and rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "They don't get it," she said, "or they don't want to get it. Either way, you don't owe them anything." Still, the texts kept coming. Marissa sent a few more. Then Noah chimed in, calling me a drama queen for making everything about me. Chloe even sent a message, just a single emoji, a shrug. That one stung more than it should have. A few days later, my dad called. I debated answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Alex," he said, his voice heavy with irritation. "I don't know what you're trying to prove by ignoring everyone, but it's childish." "I'm not trying to prove anything," I replied. "I'm just done pretending this is a real family." He didn't like that. "You're being ridiculous. Marissa and I have always done our best for you." I couldn't help it, I laughed. "Your best? You didn't even show up to my high school graduation." "I told you, Chloe had a competition," he snapped, as if that somehow justified it. "We've supported you in other ways." "Name one," I said. "Just one." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, he sighed and muttered something about me being ungrateful before hanging up. That's when I made my decision. If they weren't going to respect my boundaries, I needed to be more explicit. I sent a group text to my dad, Marissa, and Noah. I've thought about this a lot, and I need to say it clearly. I don't want to be part of this family anymore. Please don't contact me unless it's an emergency. I need to move on. It felt both terrifying and liberating to hit send. For the first time in my life, I was prioritizing my own well-being over their expectations. Of course, they didn't take it well. Marissa texted back almost immediately, accusing me of being selfish and immature. Noah called me a lost cause. My dad didn't respond at all, which somehow hurt the most. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my life. Therapy helped a lot. Shout out to Dr. Grace for being an absolute rock star. She helped me understand that my feelings were valid and that walking away from a toxic situation doesn't make you a bad person. Harper was my biggest cheerleader, always reminding me that I deserved better. For the first time, I felt free. I threw myself into work, started running again, and even picked up a new hobby, photography. Harper and I would spend weekends exploring parks and taking pictures, and I found myself smiling more than I had in years. But just when I thought I was finally moving on, my dad threw a curveball I never saw coming. One day, I came home to find a letter taped to my door. It was from a lawyer, James something. I opened it cautiously, my heart racing. The letter said my dad and Marissa were considering legal action to secure regular family visitation under some obscure law about preserving family bonds. I couldn't believe what I was reading. They were threatening to sue me for family time. I called Harper immediately. She was just as shocked as I was. "Can they even do that?" she asked. "I have no idea," I admitted. "But it's insane, right? Who does that?" "People who can't handle being told no," she said grimly. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do. Ryan, my best friend, came over to help me sort through the legal jargon in the letter. Ryan's the kind of guy who stays calm in a crisis, which was exactly what I needed. "This is ridiculous," he said after reading the letter. "They don't have a case. You're an adult. They can't force you to spend time with them. But they can make my life hell trying," I pointed out. He nodded reluctantly. "True. You might want to talk to a lawyer, just in case." So that's what I did. I found a family lawyer who confirmed that the chances of my dad and Marissa winning such a case were slim to none. But he also warned me that these kinds of cases could drag on for months and cost a fortune in legal fees. "They might not win," the lawyer said, "but they could still make this very painful for you." I felt sick. Why were they doing this? Was it really about wanting to spend time with me, or was it just another way to control me? Harper thought it was the latter. They're trying to break you down, she said. Don't let them. Things escalated quickly after that. My dad started leaving voicemails, alternating between guilt-tripping me and outright threatening me. Marissa sent long, rambling emails about how I was tearing the family apart. Noah even showed up at my work once, causing a scene until my manager asked him to leave. It was exhausting. No matter how much I tried to distance myself, they kept pulling me back into their drama. I felt like I was drowning. Then, one day, I got a text from Chloe. It was the first time she'd reached out since Thanksgiving. The message said, I don't know why you're doing this, but I hope you're happy. Dad's really upset, and Mom won't stop crying. You've ruined everything. I stared at the screen for a long time, my emotions a tangled mess of anger and sadness. Part of me wanted to reply, to explain why I'd made the choices I had. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. They didn't want to understand. They just wanted me to fall back in line. By the end of that week, I was emotionally drained. Harper convinced me to take a weekend off and go hiking with her to clear my head. It was exactly what I needed. Standing at the top of a mountain, looking out over the vast expanse of trees and sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to let my dad and Marissa control me anymore. They could threaten, guilt-trip, and manipulate all they wanted, but I wasn't going back. I couldn't. Of course, the peace didn't last long. A few days after our trip, I got another letter from the lawyer. This one wasn't a threat. It was a formal notice of their intent to file a lawsuit. My heart sank as I read the words. They were really going through with it. And that's when I knew. This was only the beginning of the fight. When I got the formal notice of the lawsuit, I sat there staring at the paper for what felt like hours. It was surreal. Who sues their own child for family time? I thought about throwing the letter in the trash, pretending it didn't exist, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. This was real, and I had to deal with it. Harper was furious when I told her. They're seriously doing this? Alex, this is insane. Normal people don't sue their kids for attention. Yeah, well, my family isn't exactly normal, I muttered. She grabbed the letter, scanning it with a scowl. What even is this? Failure to uphold familial obligations? Is that a real thing? Apparently it was, at least technically. The lawyer I'd consulted earlier explained that some states had vague family preservation laws that allowed parents to petition for visitation rights, even with adult children. The chances of my dad and Marissa winning were slim, but as my lawyer reminded me, slim wasn't zero. They might not win, he said during our next meeting, but they could still drag this out, which means legal fees, court appearances, and stress. What's their angle here? I asked. Why go to all this trouble? He gave me a grim look. Control. They're trying to force you back into their lives on their terms. I tried to put on a brave face, but the truth was, I felt like I was unraveling. Every day brought new emails, texts, and voicemails from my dad and Marissa. They ranged from tearful pleas to angry rants, but they all had the same underlying message. I was the bad guy for walking away. Even Noah got in on the act. He posted a passive-aggressive rant on Facebook about how some people don't value family and think they're too good for the people who raised them. He didn't mention me by name, but it didn't take a genius to figure out who he was talking about. A few mutual friends even messaged me, asking if everything was okay. The worst part was the toll it was taking on Harper. She tried so hard to stay strong for me, but I could see how much it stressed her out. She'd go quiet whenever we talked about the lawsuit. Her jaw clenched like she was trying to hold something back. One night, after we'd had yet another conversation about my family, she broke down. I just hate seeing you go through this, she said, her voice cracking. You don't deserve any of it. I pulled her into a hug, trying to reassure her, even though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. We'll get through it, I said. They're not going to win. The legal process started dragging on, just like the lawyer warned it would. There were meetings, depositions, and endless paperwork. My dad and Marissa's lawyer, a smug guy named James, argued that I was abandoning my moral duty to maintain a relationship with my family. It was absurd, but they were serious. Then, during one of the early hearings, James dropped a bombshell. He claimed my dad and Marissa were concerned about my mental health and believed my sudden estrangement was a sign of emotional instability. They even suggested I might be under undue influence from Harper. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were trying to paint me as unstable, like I couldn't make my own decisions. Harper, sitting next to me, looked like she was ready to throw something at James. After the hearing, my lawyer pulled me aside. "They're grasping at straws," he said. "It's a desperate tactic, but it could complicate things." "Complicate how?" I asked, dreading the answer. "If the court decides there's any validity to their claims, they could order a psychological evaluation." "It's unlikely, but not impossible." I spent the next few days stewing over the hearing. The idea that my own father and stepmother were trying to frame me as unstable was both infuriating and heartbreaking. It felt like they were stripping away every bit of autonomy I had, reducing me to a puppet they could control. Harper tried to cheer me up by suggesting a weekend getaway, but I couldn't bring myself to relax. All I could think about was the lawsuit and the possibility of it dragging on for months, maybe even years. Then, one evening, Ryan called me out of the blue. "You sitting down?" he asked. "What now?" I groaned. "I did some digging, and I think you're going to want to hear this." Ryan had a knack for sniffing out information, and this time, he'd hit the jackpot. Apparently, my dad and Marissa were in serious financial trouble. Their house had a second mortgage, Noah's college loans were through the roof, and Chloe's extracurriculars were bleeding them dry. On top of that, my dad's business had taken a hit during the pandemic, and they were struggling to stay afloat. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew the answer. "They might be banking on you feeling guilty enough to come back and help out," Ryan said. "Or maybe they think dragging you through court will pressure you into settling." Settling? Of course. If they could guilt me into paying their legal fees, or better yet, giving them money outright, they'd come out ahead. It was classic manipulation, and I hated that I hadn't seen it sooner. Armed with this new information, I went straight to my lawyer. He advised me to keep it in my back pocket for now, but it felt good to have something to fight back with. For the first time, I felt like I had some control over the situation. At the next hearing, I sat across from my dad and Marissa, watching as they tried to spin the narrative that they were just concerned parents who wanted to reconnect with their son. It was nauseating, but I refused to let them see me crack. When James brought up the mental health angle again, my lawyer shut him down immediately. "There's no evidence to support these claims," he said firmly. "This is nothing more than an attempt to defame my client." The judge seemed skeptical of their arguments, which gave me a small glimmer of hope. Still, I knew this was far from over. Later that week, I got a call from Chloe. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She hesitated for a moment before saying, I don't get why you're doing this. Dad's really upset, and Mom keeps crying. Can't you just come home and fix this?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For all her flaws, Chloe was still just a kid, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. But I also knew I couldn't let her guilt me into going back. "I'm sorry you're upset," I said carefully, "but this isn't something I can fix. I need to do what's best for me." She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold. "Fine, do whatever you want." The call ended, and I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. It felt like I was losing every piece of my family, one by one. Despite everything, I wasn't giving up. I was tired, angry, and emotionally drained, but I wasn't going to let my dad and Marissa win. They'd already taken so much from me. I wasn't going to let them take my freedom too. By the time the next hearing rolled around, I was running on fumes. The stress of the lawsuit had started to bleed into every part of my life. Work felt like a chore, my sleep was erratic, and even my time with Harper, which was usually my escape, felt strained. But I knew I couldn't let my dad and Marissa win. They'd already taken too much from me. What I didn't realize was that the next twist was just around the corner, and it was bigger than anything I could have imagined. The first crack came during a deposition. My lawyer, a no-nonsense guy named Mark, had started pressing my dad about why they were so intent on forcing me back into the family fold. At first, my dad stuck to the usual script about wanting to repair our relationship and preserve family bonds. But as Mark kept pushing, my dad started to slip. "It's not just about that," he blurted at one point, his face turning red. "This whole thing has been blown out of proportion." "Blown out of proportion how?" Mark asked, his tone calm but relentless. My dad clammed up after that, but something about his reaction made my skin crawl. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was fear. It was like he'd accidentally revealed too much and was trying to backtrack. After the deposition, I asked Mark what he thought. "There's something they're not telling us," he said. "We need to find out what it is." Ryan was the first person I called after that. If anyone could dig up dirt, it was him. I explained what happened and asked him to look into my dad's finances again. It felt like a long shot, but I was desperate for answers. A few days later, Ryan called me back, and his tone was urgent. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Your dad and Marissa are in deeper trouble than I thought. It's not just financial issues. They're being investigated for fraud." My stomach dropped. "What kind of fraud?" "Tax fraud, mostly," Ryan explained. "I found some court filings from a few months ago. Apparently, your dad's business has been under investigation for falsifying financial records. If they get convicted, they could lose everything." I was stunned. Suddenly, everything made sense. Their desperation, the lawsuit, the constant manipulation. They weren't just trying to guilt me into coming back. They needed me as a scapegoat, someone they could rely on to bail them out of the mess they'd created. Armed with this new information, I went straight to Mark. He confirmed that if my dad and Marissa were being investigated for fraud, it could explain their sudden push for family reconciliation. They probably thought that having me back in their lives would make them look better in court. Or worse, they might have planned to drag me into their financial mess as a way to deflect blame. "They're using you," Mark said bluntly. "And this lawsuit is just another tool to control you." Hearing it put so plainly was both validating and infuriating. I felt like a pawn in some twisted game they were playing, and I was done letting them call the shots. The next hearing was a turning point. My lawyer brought up the ongoing fraud investigation, carefully weaving it into our arguments without crossing any legal lines. The judge seemed intrigued but didn't press the issue yet. My dad, on the other hand, looked like he was about to explode. After the hearing, he cornered me in the hallway. His face was a mix of anger and desperation. "What are you trying to do, Alex?" he hissed. "Tear this family apart even more?" "This family was broken long before I walked away," I shot back. "You're the one dragging me into court, remember?" He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and stormed off, leaving me feeling both triumphant and hollow. As the weeks went on, I started to notice a shift in Marissa's behavior. She'd always been cold and dismissive toward me, but now she seemed nervous, jumpy, even. At one point, during a mediation session, she started crying halfway through and had to leave the room. It was so out of character that even Harper, who had zero sympathy for her, looked surprised. Later, Ryan called with another update. He'd been digging deeper into the fraud case and found something even more damning. Evidence that Marissa might have been involved in laundering money through one of my dad's business accounts. It was getting messier by the minute, and I was smack in the middle of it. I finally confronted my dad about everything during a family mediation session. It wasn't planned. I just had enough. "Why don't you tell the court about the fraud investigation?" I said, my voice steady but loud enough to make everyone freeze. "Why don't you tell them the real reason you're so desperate to drag me back into your lives?" The color drained from his face. Marissa looked like she might faint. Their lawyer tried to deflect, but the damage was done. The judge ordered a recess, and my dad refused to make eye contact with me as he walked out of the room. Harper squeezed my hand, her expression a mix of pride and worry. "You just dropped a bomb," she whispered. "I know," I said, "and I'm not done yet." Over the next few weeks, things started unraveling for my dad and Marissa. The fraud investigation became public knowledge, and local news outlets started picking up the story. They were scrambling to contain the damage, but it was too late. Their perfect little facade was crumbling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Meanwhile, the lawsuit against me lost steam. Their lawyers stopped showing up to hearings, and eventually, the case was dismissed. It was a huge relief, but I knew the fight wasn't over yet. My dad and Marissa weren't the type to go down quietly. One night, I got a call from Chloe. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "I didn't know," she said, her voice shaky. "About the fraud, the money, any of it. I swear I didn't know." For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Chloe was just a kid, caught in the crossfire of a battle she didn't fully understand. But then I remembered all the times she treated me like an outsider, and my sympathy faded. "Now you know," I said flatly, "and I hope you realize this isn't my mess to clean up." She started to cry, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I wasn't her emotional punching bag anymore. By the time the dust settled, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. My dad and Marissa were facing criminal charges, Chloe had stopped reaching out, and Noah had blocked me on every platform imaginable. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the one I needed. For the first time in my life, I was free. With the lawsuit dismissed and my father and Marissa's world falling apart, I should have felt relief. And for a moment, I did. But the reality of what had unfolded, the fractured relationships, the lies, the manipulation, left a bitter taste in my mouth. I wasn't just dealing with the fallout of a legal battle. I was grieving the family I'd hoped I could have, even if it had never really existed. In the weeks after the case was thrown out, things were eerily quiet. My dad and Marissa stopped reaching out entirely, which was both a blessing and a curse. Ryan joked that they were probably too busy dealing with the fraud charges to bother me anymore, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Harper and I spent a lot of time talking about what had happened. She was proud of me for standing up for myself, but I could tell she was worried too. I'd been carrying so much anger and sadness for so long that it was starting to seep into other parts of my life. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she turned to me and said, "You know you don't have to hold on to this forever, right?" "Hold on to what?" I asked, even though I knew what she meant. "The pain, the resentment. You can let it go, Alex." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I knew how. Then, out of nowhere, I got another call from Chloe. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but something in me told me to pick up. Her voice was quiet, almost timid. "Hey," she said. I wanted to say I'm sorry." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "Sorry? For what?" "For how I treated you," she said. "For everything. I didn't understand how bad things were for you, but I do now. And I'm sorry." Her words caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years resenting Chloe for the role she played in my exclusion, but hearing her apologize made me realize she'd been a victim of our parents' toxicity too. She was just a kid, after all, caught in the middle of a storm she couldn't control. "I appreciate that," I said after a long pause. "I really do." We talked for a while after that. She told me how the fraud investigation had turned her life upside down. Their house was being sold, and Noah had moved out, refusing to have anything to do with the family. Marissa was barely holding it together, and my dad had become increasingly withdrawn and angry. "It's like everything's falling apart," Chloe said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." Her vulnerability hit me harder than I expected. For all her faults, she was still my little sister. And despite everything, a part of me still cared about her. "Focus on yourself," I said gently. "You can't fix them, Chloe. Trust me, I've tried." A few days later, I got an email from my dad. It was short and to the point. "Alex, I know things haven't been perfect between us, but I want to make things right. Please meet me for coffee. Just you and me. No lawyers, no drama." Let me explain. I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between curiosity and anger. Part of me wanted to delete the email without a second thought, but another part of me, a quieter, more hopeful part, wanted to hear him out. When I showed the email to Harper, she didn't hesitate. "You don't owe him anything," she said. "But if you think it'll help you find closure, I'll support you." A week later, I found myself sitting across from my dad at a small, nondescript coffee shop. He looked older than I remembered, the stress of the past few months etched into every line on his face. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I'm glad you came, he said, his voice shaky. I didn't think you would. I'm not here for you, I said flatly. I'm here because I need answers. He nodded, his eyes downcast. Fair enough. What followed was one of the most uncomfortable conversations of my life. My dad admitted to everything, the favoritism, the neglect, the manipulation. He said he'd been so consumed by his grief after my mom died that he didn't know how to be a father anymore. When Marissa came into the picture, he latched onto her and her kids as a way to fill the void. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I see now that I failed you. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his excuses didn't matter, that the damage had already been done. But instead, I just sat there, numb. What do you want from me? I asked finally. Why did you ask me to meet you? He looked up, tears in his eyes. I want a second chance. I didn't give him an answer that day. I needed time to think, to process everything he'd said. Harper and I talked about it for hours, going over every detail of the conversation. In the end, I realized that while I couldn't forget what my dad had done, I also couldn't hold on to the anger forever. So, I made a decision. I called my dad and told him the truth. I wasn't ready to forgive him, but I was willing to try, on my terms. Over the next few months, I started rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I kept my distance from my dad and Marissa, setting firm boundaries that I refused to compromise on. Chloe and I started talking more, and while our relationship was far from perfect, it felt like a step in the right direction. As for my dad, I kept him at arm's length. He made an effort, but I wasn't ready to let him back into my life completely. Maybe I never would be, and that was okay. Looking back, I realized that walking away from my family wasn't just about cutting them off. It was about reclaiming my sense of self. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free to live my life on my own terms, without the weight of their expectations dragging me down. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was worth it. And while I don't know what the future holds, I do know one thing. I'm finally at peace. And that's enough.